Good afternoon. My name is Carl Mercurio. I'm the President of Corporate Research Group, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar on effectively managing exchange implementation efforts. Thank you for joining us. Our speakers today are Delana Anderson. She is the President of ACA Solutions, and Rona Wiener. He is the President of Excelbright Consulting. There are full speaker bios available at the Corporate Research Group website, and also on your screen there's some additional details about today's speakers. Before we get started, the speakers will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So before we get started, I just wanted to say that we encourage you to type in and submit questions as the presentations are ongoing. You can use the chat box on your screen to submit your questions. This way we'll have a nice lineup of questions ready to go when we get to the Q&A portion of the show. Also, if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, again, please use the chat box to submit any problems or issues you may be having, and we'll try to get to them as best we can. So without further ado, let us start the presentation with Delana Anderson.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Technical difficulties, starting from the top. So thank you, Carl, for the introduction. Thank you to the attendees for joining us today. To review the high-level agenda for today's webinar, we'll basically go back through the objectives of the webinar, what we intend to achieve over the next hour. We'll discuss some of the exchange implementation challenges that are out before us as an industry. We'll talk about some mitigation approaches that you can use to address some of those challenges. We'll share some guiding principles and some practical examples of how you can mitigate those risks. Specifically, we'll talk about translating the multitude of regulations into actual business requirements, utilizing those requirements to build an implementation plan to manage the cross-functional initiative that's out there. We'll talk about managing change and managing the open issues that exist out there, about some next steps, and then we'll wrap by opening up the webinar to answer any questions that you might have. Rona?
So to recap our webinar objectives, to webinar we're going to demonstrate an approach for efficiently and effectively planning and managing exchange implementations. Our goal is to provide best practices and practical examples that you can immediately use to assess your current state and improvement opportunities, build or enhance an implementation plan, improve cross-functional collaboration, enable better categorization and executive reporting, track items such as pending legislation to mitigate risk, and utilize an effective change management process. We want to make sure that we're striking the right balance between theory and practice. We know that your time is valuable, and we want to provide some immediate benefits, and we hope that we can give you some tips and tricks that you can put into practice immediately.
All right, so we're going to start with an overview of what the exchange implementation challenges are. Just a brief summary of the current environment that exists out there. So I'm sure you're well aware that October 1 seems like it's right around the corner for open enrollment. Obviously, capitalizing on opportunities in this new channel not only requires tactical transformation, it's a strategic transformation as well. Exchange-related projects and initiatives are complex, and they require cross-functional planning and coordination. A range of systems and processes need to be updated. A sample of those are, creating new product designs, integrating with the exchange framework or various exchange frameworks, and one of the more complex is the compliance with the cost-sharing reductions and premium tax credit requirements. That's just in a few. And many of the regulations yet to be finalized, effective risk and change management are also critical success factors. So, one of the big challenges is the compressed timeline. So here we sit at the end of 2012, and we have then a year for open enrollment and barely a year to get to the first coverage effective date. Another challenge is that change is inevitable. You are going to have to move forward making some working assumptions. In the last 3 weeks, 5 proposed rules have been released, as well as some IRS guidance. And obviously, that's not the end of what's yet to come. For each proposed rule, there's obviously interim and final rules yet to be released. We know that there's a proposed rule for navigators outstanding. In addition to the Health and Human Services Notice of Benefit and Payment Parameters, you'll need to get your arms around the state notices and how they're altering any federal standards, and many more. So effectively managing that change is an important aspect to this initiative. So scope complexity standpoint, there's a variety of things impacting the scope. One is the number of exchange topics are out there, as well as the intricate relationship. As you can see on the diagram, we've tried to give you a picture of the various topics and how they're all interrelated. So, what this all brings about is a lot of complexity in trying to manage your stakeholders and eliminate duplication of effort, as well as minimizing any gaps. Another scope complexity is this impacts every functional area and pretty much every system that the health plans have. From the beginning of the process of developing your QHPs through new sales channels, new marketing channels, to new enrollment feeds and eligibility processes, claims processing, commissions, etc. So this has an enterprise-wide impact to the health plan. And so, the reality is that any one of those things by itself creates a project challenge, but the combination of the three really can be overwhelming. What is the right approach for addressing these challenges?
So in the next few slides, we're going to talk a little bit about our mitigation approach and some of the high-level guiding principles that we use. The first step is to bring some order to all of this chaos. In this slide, you can see our vision, or how we'd like to try and structure some of the components of any implementation effort. We're seeing 5 major layers of activities taking place. The top 2 are around decision-making, which we think belongs in 2 different levels. There are strategic business decisions and operational decisions, and we've listed examples for both. At the strategic level, you have items that are more related to market entry strategy and enrollment periods. And at the operational level, you have more tactical decisions around staffing, internal business processes, and integration approach. This presentation is going to focus on the bottom 3 layers. You can see that the central layer, implementation, is where we're spending most of our time. That is focusing on planning, project management, and execution. It also has two other layers that are closely related to it, and those are validation, which is around verifying compliance and initiating adjustments to implementation efforts, and change management, which is primarily around monitoring regulations, assessing the impact, and then implementing those changes. On the left-hand side, you can see that we have some arrows, and we want to highlight the connections between these lanes. We will show some more of the connections between the individual components later on, but at the high level, you'll notice that all of the layers provide inputs for the implementation layer, and a lot of the efforts around change management are going to focus on managing this process effectively. So you want to make sure that you are focusing on ownership and along with the process, so each one of those lanes need to have an appropriate owner, and each one of those tasks need to have an owner associated with it as well. So let's talk about guiding principles. At high level, those are some of the best practices that we've identified. We'll start at the top with centralizing planning, and this is around having a single coordinator for your implementation efforts. This is very much a full-time job, and what you want to do here is strike the right balance between the big picture and some of those small critical details. You want someone that can answer the question, are we on track? They're not necessarily going to know everything, but they should know where everything can be found. And that spans both the strategic decisions, project plans, schedule, and reporting. Next practice is around clearly defining the scope boundaries. There are several different interrelated initiatives. You have a connection between your exchange readiness and other healthcare reform initiatives. And you want to make sure that as you're looking at all of those different pieces, that you are separating your work stream in a way that is making it efficient for people to reuse work, collaborate, and not produce any overlap, which leads us right into our next best practice around minimizing overlap, gaps, and rework. In addition to clearly defining the scope, you also want to make sure that you're using categorization and groupings effectively, and those may vary by phase. We're going to be looking at that in detail in some further slides. And you want to make sure that you're maintaining traceability. There's a high potential for overlap due to all of the challenges that we just touched on, and so implementing some best practices here will really pay off in the long run. The piece of that puzzle is maximizing the reuse of process, templates, and content. This is where you want to take the time to plan and resist the pressure from the compressed timeline. Even though there's not a lot of time to work with, taking the time to defining things correctly the first time around will definitely save time in the long run. Some common best practices, such as using a central repository and making sure that you have some compliance verification for your templates and process, and a feedback loop from participants to make sure that any adjustments are being addressed. This is really all of your project management and business analysis best practices really pay off. If you don't have them in place, it's never too late to start. It's a good opportunity to improve some of your organization's capability framework maturity level, or just make some perhaps baby steps in the right direction. Without some of those best practices in place, it can be a real challenge when you're looking at these large-scale projects with a lot of dependencies and constraints to keep everything moving in the right direction. Those two best practices are tied together as well. You want to effectively engage stakeholders using communication plans, a RACI matrix, which we'll touch on later, that aligns stakeholders with their responsibilities and topics they're involved with. Making sure that you have some effective meetings and reviews processes. So, for example, if a new rule is being issued, as you all know, the rules documents are extremely lengthy. You don't want to have everyone on an initiative reading through all of that. If you have an effective process to make sure that information is being analyzed and produced in different output formats, such as executive summaries to the appropriate stakeholders, you could really save some time. And you want to promote accountability. So this is where using an implementation plan and having frequent calibration is important, along with reporting and some clear consequences for addressing issues. So let us connect these best practices into a practical implementation. Now that we understand some of those guiding principles, we want to see how we put them into practice. There are many ways to implement the best practices, but we thought that providing real-life examples will most clearly illustrate the concepts, as well as help you better understand and follow them. The examples in this presentation are primarily from the Exchange Implementation Navigator, which is a custom Excel solution that captures all of the Exchange business requirements, implementation plan, and open items in a single location. So how we've implemented some of those best practices is we need to make sure that we're enabling links so that we have some enhanced search capabilities and a one-stop shop for information. It's designed for cross-initiative planning and provides built-in traceability, as well as promoting some consistency and reuse through key features. We have a predefined structure and methodology that we will step through. We drop down values to maintain data integrity and support some copy and paste functionality, as well as supporting executive reporting and minimizing version conflicts. We want to go ahead and get into some of the details and visualize some of these best practices in real life. The first step to the process is to translate the regulations into requirements. Our objective is to translate all of the Exchange regulations into a consumable business requirements format. We have a constant stream of new and updated rules, and we want to make sure that we have a good way of efficiently processing and communicating that information. Some of the guiding principles here is that we want the information to be comprehensive. All of the regulations and impacts should be covered, as well as centralized to help mitigate some of those overlap and gaps challenges. We want to use a consistent structure and formatting. We want to maintain traceability through the regulations while still building in some categorization and hierarchy which support the search capabilities and some of the other best practices. Again, there are many different ways that you can do this. We're just going to illustrate some real-life examples to help you visualize these concepts, and those include also the change management support and the data integrity best practices. So I want to go ahead and take a quick look at that. The process that we went through to go from the rules into something manageable is to convert that content from PDF to Excel. We extracted content for requirements by removing all of the extra content, such as the introduction, the headers and footers, and the preambles, and we converted all of that content into a consistent structure. We went through leveling, which is the process of making sure that all of the requirements are in a uniform layout. The rule structure in the regulation uses a leveled numbering system, but authors are not consistent in their use. So you may have sections that have requirements at the section level, and some of them will drill down into levels 3 or 4, and then we'll have requirements that are of the same magnitude as the requirements in the higher sections. And so we want to make sure that we have a uniform playing field for information. We are using regulation IDs as the unique IDs to maintain traceability. We have a regulation name that is, for the most part, auto-generated from the section names and the actual regulation text. We then adjust the automated conversion output for leveling exceptions, as I just mentioned, regulation name exceptions, where in some cases, and those of you who are intimately familiar with the rules, I'm sure understand some of the pain points here, where some regulations actually are not named or several regulations will have the same name. We also included some keywords to support enhanced search capabilities and applied consistent formatting. What does all of that look like? So here's a good snapshot of before and after. You can see the information from the Federal Register with a small snapshot from some of the rules, in this particular case related to SHOP. And then you can see how that information looked at the output once we have all of that information in a nice, clean structure showing the regulation IDs and related information. And that structure leads us to a much better layout to be able to then start our analysis and categorization work. And I will turn it back over to Delana here to cover the analysis and categorization.
So now with the regulation parsed into, much smaller bites, we were able to leverage our industry experience and review each of those rows within the parsed regulation to specifically determine the health plan impact. So our focus has been real about the health plans, their third-party administrators and technology vendors. So it has not been with a focus on how a state exchange, what are the requirements for a state exchange. It's all about what does it mean to the health plans. So we did the analysis and determined the high-level business requirements. We went through and categorized those in a couple of different ways. We did it first by impact type, and on the next slide I'm going to talk about what those impact types are. In general, they help you identify parent-child relationships. So in many instances, the regulations provide a lower level of detail about a higher level business requirement. And the reality is that when we parse the regulations that we've got, you end up with about 730, so over 700 rows in Excel workbook. And by doing some categorization by impact type, you're able to kind of marry those things together and boil it down into about 180 rows. So still a lot of information, but it starts making it more manageable. The other useful categorization was around a primary issuer function, and we're going to show examples of that later as well, but things like billing claims, etc. And after you do the categorization, it's imperative that you link the children to their parents, which then creates cross-references so that you can see all of the requirements together for a particular business requirement. And then the large volume of requirements and content overlap requires a significant effort for iterative reviews and QA checks. So once you've done the initial pass-through, going back through and doing validation checks to make sure you got the hierarchy right and make sure that you don't have any children that aren't matched up to their parent, looking for consistency amongst the high primary issuer functions as well. That mentioned an example of the impact types. So this kind of lays out for you in a parent-child relationship. So these would be your parents over here. So the example would be mandatory requirements. Some of the requirements are mandatory regardless of whether you're in an FFE, whether you're in a state with a state-based exchange. You must do them. And then underneath that, there are children that include details or rules about that mandatory requirement. In some instances, there's definitions. Likewise, there's some cross-reference where it doesn't create new requirements, but there's additional information you might want to know. A different type of parent, for example, would be a conditional state decision. So in some instances, although there's a federal standard established, states have the opportunity to modify that federal standard should they so choose, right? So HHS's mantra has been state flexibility. So it's helpful to know which of those regulations actually have a state decision possible out there so that you can be monitoring your state decisions for those requirements. And examples of children of a conditional state decision will include downstream impacts because they made that decision. Then here are additional requirements as a result of that decision. There could also be cross-reference, etc. So there are parent-child relationships that you would find in the Navigator, but hopefully this gives you an idea of the concept, how you can turn 730 rows of parsed regulations and business requirements and narrow it down into a manageable number for the implementation plan. example of categorization was by functional area. So examples of that would be actuarial, and things included in their area of responsibility would be obviously the pricing and claims reserves. And I'm not going to go through, you can obviously read those. And obviously there's a lot of functional areas that are not on here, but hopefully this gives you an idea of categorization that could be utilized. The real example coming out of the navigators. So you can see regulation ID, the name. You've got some columns hidden here that show what the business requirements were. But here's where you start seeing the impact type for each of those rows. Not applicable would be an indication that there really is no carrier impact. There are a lot of things that are exchange requirements, not carrier requirements. So when it boils down to it, it's nice to have it here. You might want to reference the regulation text to take a look at it. But from analysis and an implementation standpoint, it really doesn't have an impact to you. So that's an example of the impact type. And then you can see the issuer function over here as column. And that provides for some good counts on that executive reporting. If you're curious how many requirements you have by a given issuer function, you're able to easily provide some executive level reporting for that. Okay, and now back to you.
So your previous section talked about how to get from regulations to requirements. Once you have all of the requirements together, the next step is to build an implementation plan that would utilize those requirements. So our objective here is to effectively manage exchange implementation efforts. Some of our guiding principles, we want to manage at the core parent requirement level. And what we mean by that is that there are quite a lot of low-level details when you're looking at regulations and in the requirements format as well. And it's sometimes very challenging to be able to manage down in the weeds. And what we want to do is support a big picture management. And the way that we've done that is we link the supporting child requirements to their parents. So there may be a parent item such as the requirement to implement cost-sharing reductions or requirements around the products being at the different middle levels. And what we do, we take all of the details around that, such as the definition for each metal level, etc., and we roll them all up because you don't want to be managing each one of those and assigning each one of those out. And those core parents then become the outline for your implementation plan, and each one of those require attributes to determine which initiative it's assigned to, etc. Some of the other guiding principles are around having an in-scope identifier, so you don't want to lose visibility to requirements that are currently out of scope. Let's say, for example, that you believe that you have made the strategic decision to not participate in the shop, but only participate in the individual exchange. And so you have marked all of your requirements for the shop as out of scope. You don't want to be deleting those. You just want to filter them out. And the reason is just the incredible amount of change in the industry at the moment. So with some of the new rules coming out, it appears that you may be required to participate in the shop in order to participate in the individual exchange. And so at that point, it will be much easier to be able to just regarage all of those requirements as in scope, as opposed to having to go back and try to reuse them to your plan. Some other best practices here have to do with allocation and accountability, so how you assign those requirements out and make sure that whoever the requirements are assigned to, that there's some reporting and accountability tied to that. Making sure that they're prioritized, that you're identifying dependencies, and also maintaining traceability, which is done in two different directions. So upstream is going back from your implementation plan to your requirements and further upstream back to the actual regulations. And downstream is tying to the individual projects, initiatives, or tasks that are being used to implement those. The main reason that you want to maintain that in both directions is for activities such as change management and impact assessment, where if you know that a set of regulations is being changed, if you have traceability in place, all you need to do is just basically search for or put in the regulation IDs that are changing, and you get a really nice map of all of the impacted areas. So I'll go ahead and bridge some of those gaps here by showing how we implement some of those best practices. In the interest of time, we're not going to cover each one of those in the case of the implementation tab, simply because there are so many of them, but we are going to highlight some key points. So you can see on this screen from the implementation plan that we have core requirements information that is being brought up with a lookup, keeping our original regulation IDs for traceability over here, as well as the regulation name, since most people relate to names better than they do to IDs. Here's that in-scope identifier that we touched on, so that we can easily toggle different items to be in or out of scope, as the identification of owners and assignees. You'll notice one of the best practices here, we want to make sure that we have a single owner and a single assignee. We have a column for additional stakeholders, which we'll talk about more later, but it is quite important to make sure there's just a single person that is accountable. Otherwise, you tend to often get into situations where it is not clear why something is or is not getting done. You'll also see some additional columns on the right for priority and status, and additional columns here that we did not include on this screenshot. And then drop-down values here. So all of these items are all drop-down values. None of this is typed in, so they're all configurable on a separate tab, and that supports data integrity so that you can easily pull out reports or filter this information or sort it in a way that is meaningful to a particular task. I also want to highlight some recommendations based on lesson learned. So we touched on that on the previous slide. We want to separate the owner and the assignee. So somebody is accountable, but more often than not, that is not the person that is actually executing the work. You want to use an iterative assignment process. We found that as these are assigned and people start working on them, they will often realize that there's impact to additional areas, or they do not have sufficient information to move forward. And so you're going to circle through and just start somewhere and assign those out either to your initiatives, work streams, leads. It depends on your organizational structure and the approach that you're taking. Make sure that you are using a single assignee for each one of those requirements, and then you will loop back as time goes by and refine those assignments. So it is quite common for requirements to move from one owner to another, and that is not really a reason for concern as long as they are on schedule and they're not impacting any other dependencies. You want to integrate this information with your RACI matrix and communication plan, and we actually have an example for that for you on the following slide. So this is an example of what a RACI matrix looks like. It is listing all of your stakeholders, and obviously in real life these would have real names, and responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed in each area. In this particular example, we've structured them by high-level exchange topics, such as subsidies, essential health benefits, or enrollment. You can certainly structure them by functional areas or lower-level topics. Based on our experience to date, we found that this structure works better because you do not have as many categories to manage. There tend to be a large number of stakeholders across a large number of departments, which can make this a little difficult to manage effectively. So if you can reduce the number of categories, that is definitely helpful. And you can see that you want to make sure that each topic has one and only one accountable party, but there can certainly be multiple stakeholders that are responsible, consulted, or informed for the same subject. Some other recommendations related to downstream traceability. For high-level requirement, you want to identify impacted system for each market segment. And this is easier said than done. It's fairly complex. But the reason you want to step through that exercise is because it allows you to group requirements more effectively. There are several different grouping approaches, and I want to touch on a few of them here. The first one is to group requirements by exchange topic. I recommend doing that for cross-functional reviews, strategy decisions, and training. It is very helpful for introductory materials, so when you want to kind of get your arms around everything related to cost sharing or everything related to eligibility, that'd be a good approach. However, it does not work as well when you start looking at implementation, simply because exchange topics tend to span functional areas and systems. And so here's where we switch to looking at grouping by system for technology changes and by functional area or process for non-technology changes. One of the benefits of grouping by system is that you do not want to have multiple projects impacting the same system running in parallel if you can avoid it. So if I have cost sharing reduction requirements that are impacting my claim system, and I also have some requirements for Native Americans that are also impacting the same system, and I have some eligibility requirements or billing requirements impacting the same system. I don't want to have those as individual projects because that is reducing my chance of reuse and avoiding conflicts. So ideally, you want to try and get all of the changes for the same system implemented at one time, and just keep the traceability back to the requirements where you can see the actual functional area or process that change is supporting. For technology changes, such as changing your call center policies or changing a business process, you can certainly group those by functional areas, and that is more effective than grouping by system. And then for reporting purposes, you will more frequently be grouping your requirements by owner and status. An owner can be an initiative or project as well as a person to show the progress report and what is left to be done and who is responsible for executing that work. The last piece of the puzzle there is capturing your project IDs. So for most organizations, you probably have some project management methodology in place where you are listing your projects and tracking their status, etc. So we do not propose that you duplicate that work. You just want to find the right place to link that work. So linking your requirements to the projects can be done in the implementation plan, or if you have a more robust project management tool, you can actually do that in the project tool as well, just by providing a cross-reference back to the requirements. So now I have an implementation plan. The next step is to talk about managing change. And there's quite a lot of change involved, and we touched on that in the challenges. Our objective here is to plan for changes and respond effectively. We know that they're coming. So some guiding principles here are to establish a process for consuming changes from each layer, and we touched on those layers earlier. So as new decisions are being made, as regulations are evolving, and as we identify compliance issues, we want to make sure that we already have a repeatable process for getting that information to the implementation layer. That process should include some stakeholder notification to make sure the right people are engaged, an impact analysis, implementation plan updates, and of course a feedback loop for issues. So even though the primarily flow of information is from the other layers into implementation, you do have to make sure that you have a good way to loop back when items cannot be implemented as requested. Last but not least point here, make sure that you budget sufficient hours for change management. Rework activities and compliance reviews are a lot more time consuming than they may seem at a glance. Make sure that there is plenty of both time on the schedule and resources available to handle this ever-evolving set of regulations and decisions that are being made as the deadline approaches. So let's provide a visual of some of the top points we touched on. This is the slide we looked at earlier for layers and components, but focusing more on connectivity and the areas where you want to define your processes are all of these red arrows. We did not depict all of the connections here. You can see how complex that would get, but we did highlight some of the key items. Strategic business decisions tend to flow into operational decisions, which tend to flow into the initial planning phase for implementation, which will then lead you to your downstream tests. We also have a loopback for feedback from execution back to strategic and also into operational decisions, as the input from validation into the planning phase of implementation to make those changes, and from the change management where we monitor the regulations, and after our impact assessment, we'll be feeding changes back into implementation as well. So each one of those arrows should require a process. It does not have to be an elaborate process definition with a lot of diagrams. It can be as simple as a single paragraph that says who is responsible for it and what they are providing and to whom. But you do want to make sure that you have that defined and that it is clearly communicated to everyone involved, so everyone understands when a new rule is being issued, what is being done, what is the time frame, who is going to be contacting them with the actions resulting from that, and what they are expected to do once they receive that information. One last piece on managing change, we want to touch on tracking open issues. Some of our recommendations based on lessons learned to date. You want to be tracking all items that have been deferred to future rulemaking. In almost every rule, there tends to be some commentary around that in the preamble. While you're not going to bring the preambles into your actual requirements documentation, of the useful content of any regulation is in that preamble, and you do not want to lose visibility to that. So we recommend tracking that information in a separate area. In our case, it's a separate tab in the Navigator. And this is also where you would track all of your undefined, unclear, and conflicting requirements. Unfortunately, it is not unusual for a rule to conflict or contradict some previously stated regulation. And also some of them will contain statements such as to be determined, or the extremely popular phrase, in a form and manner to be specified by HHS. So you have to make sure that you're keeping track of those so that you can then establish some working assumptions and communicate with HHS regarding any concerns, and then monitor future regulations for closure. So once there is a rule issued to address those items, you want to loop back and update your requirements and then close out the open item. So then just take a moment to talk about next steps. First of all, we wanted to highlight some tips and tricks. We know that we covered a lot of information here, so just to make sure it's all sinking in, we'll summarize some of the top lessons learned to date. Number one is get started. The uncertainty is here to stay, and you want to just start with what you know. Most people, when they're faced with an overwhelming amount of information that is not clearly defined, tend to freeze and get into a let's wait and see mode. Unfortunately, there's just not that much time to get all of these changes in place. So as overwhelming as it may seem, you just need to get started. There is enough information to be able to lay out a good set of working assumptions and just move forward. So your first step would be to plan, and then you define your boundaries and allocate your requirements and start managing that implementation plan. You're going to be making some working assumptions. Remember that they are working assumptions, which means two things. One, that you want to revisit them often and make sure that they still are your best guess as to how things are going to progress. And secondly, you want to maintain flexibility. And that applies on several different places. One, in how you manage your requirements and your implementation plan, but also from a very practical technology project perspective, you want to make sure that as you're making system changes, that the system is flexible enough to do some minor changes. Obviously, you can't plan for everything, but try to keep that in mind. And in areas where you do think that things may move in a different direction, it is cost effective. You want to try and plan for some of that flexibility. And the last piece is around centralize and reuse. It is really critical with a large-scale initiative that is as complex as this one to make sure that everyone is being as efficient and effective as possible. This is time to use consistency in template, to have a clear communication plan, to make sure that the right people are involved and that you're not duplicating any work or leaving some assumptions out there that may be creating gaps. I will turn it over to Delana to talk a little bit about next steps before we transition to our Q&A.
So really just to wrap things up, critical next step would be to, based on the information we've presented today, ask yourself, is your organization prepared? How many of these best practices do you have in place? And for any gaps that you have, do you have a plan for bridging those gaps? Regardless of where you're at with your implementation, obviously we're here. We'd love to be able to help you. The examples provided in today's presentation were extracted from the Exchange Implementation Navigator, and that tool can be used to either manage your actual implementation, to do a readiness assessment to see where you're at on your Exchange initiative. We will be providing, I did see a question, there will be a deck provided afterwards that'll have the contact information in it, as well as all of the information that we presented today. And with that, I will turn it back over to Carl.
Great, thanks very much. Well, as I had mentioned at the start, if you have a question, you can type it into the chat box and hit submit, and we'll try to get to that question. The first question I'll throw out to both of you. Someone's asking if you have a general sense for sort of where health plans and ACOs and health information exchanges are in this process. How far along are they in their implementations relative to the timelines and the looming deadlines, and how engaged are they in sort of the planning and managing of this now?
Delana, would you like to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, our general sense is that in spite of the lack of final regulations, that plans are definitely moving forward rapidly. Questions we're seeing are generally around how do we get our arms around all the main question right now is, oh my gosh, how do we stay on top of the regulations? How do we then translate those regulations into meaningful impacts to the health plan? And then once we've got them, how do we divide out the work and keep track of it? So we are seeing that people are in the depths of this and moving forward with their working assumptions that they've got going. That really is where the change management becomes invaluable, because you've got to be able to turn on a dime as you get the next iteration of the regulation that comes out. You've got to be able to effectively reconcile that against the work that you've already done or the working assumptions that you've already made, figure out which ones were in alignment with those working assumptions and which ones are changes to those, and how do you do the impact assessment and actually implementing it.
You mentioned how tight the deadlines are. I mean, what's your sense that some of this may get postponed or delayed?
Everything I read and understand and hear is that HHS is adamant that the 10/1 effective date, that they're not budging, that this will move forward and it's happening.
Ready or not, here we come.
Ready or not, there you go. Yes.
And that said, there is always the possibility that while the date is not moving, potentially scaling back some of the requirements behind that. We have seen some of the intermediate dates shifting, so it is possible that not the full scale of requirements would go live on that date, but we do not believe the date is moving.
Okay. You mentioned traceability, and I'm wondering if you can sort of elaborate on how that works and give a little more color around that whole process, because it seems like that would be integral to any implementation, especially where the rules may be changing underneath.
Sure. Elena, can you pass me the presenter privileges? Thank you.
Yes.
I will go ahead and just share my screen here. So this is the Exchange Implementation Navigator where we brought in the examples for the presentation, and you can actually see the traceability in action here. So here's our list of regulations and the requirements that have been derived out of those, including the primary issuer impact, the impact type, and primary issuer function that we touched on during the presentation. And so this regulation ID column is what maintains the traceability back to the original regulation document for change management. And then we maintain that moving forward to the implementation plan, maintaining that same ID, and you can see that those are all linked together, so I can actually very easily toggle back and forth to see the details if I need them. And as well as open items and any other items that we have, they're all linked back to that original requirement. In addition to that, in the implementation plan itself, we're making traceability to downstream items. So this is where, for example, we could trace to projects with specific project IDs, systems impacted. So we have quite a few columns here since every organization works a little bit differently. And then in addition to that, we have some custom columns available where you can actually build in, there's a configuration tab where you can build in your own values if you wanted to trace to items that are not already listed here. The last type of traceability we have built in here is that hierarchy that we talked about. So children requirements are traced to parent requirements, and you can see that in this link to parent column. So in this particular example, I have a parent requirement, which is a state decision to operate an exchange, and I'm sure that that's, considering we're one day before the deadline, that's a hot topic. So this is the parent, and then I have all of the children, and this link is what allows me to say that if this, for example, if the states that operate in as an issuer decides not to have a state-based exchange, or if they do decide to have a state-based exchange, these are all of the related items that will then come into play. So it makes it fairly easy to make sure that everything is organized and linked together when we're waiting for some of these decisions, as well as making sure that when we're working with the implementation plan, we're working at high level so that we don't have to see all of those children requirements when we're trying to assign them to initiatives or people and prioritizing them, etc.
You may have already sort of answered this next question, which is that you had spoken about the segments for healthcare reform, and the question is, do you have any samples of categorized segments? But maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on some of those segments.
I guess I think one of the questions is about whether we're covering all of healthcare reform or exchanges. So at this point, the Navigator is focused on exchange requirements, and we are including the 3 R's in the scope, but we are not covering the full scope of healthcare reform. And one of the reasons for that is just the rate at which new regulations are being issued, but also that we felt that this is probably the most high-risk area, and we want to make sure that we had something solid in place to be able to assist issuers with getting their arms around this and making sure that they can finish their readiness assessment. Was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Not at this time, thank you.
Okay. And then the question was in regards to the segments themselves and what the output looks like. I'm just going to scroll on my screen for a moment. You can see that there's quite a lot of these requirements. But you can see some of the concepts that we touched on, such as the leveling and trying to get to a consistent size per requirement, as well as how the output is parsed with the, let me scroll to the left here, the regulation name and regulation text, and then all of the related information.
Oh, great. Well, we have about 5 minutes left. I don't see any additional questions. So I guess that will conclude this program. You did mention that the slides will be available. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that they'll be sent out in PDF form by a corporate research group.
Okay, good. Well, thanks again for your presentation. I thought that was great, and thanks for everyone for listening. And if you have any additional questions, you can contact Corporate Research Group, and we'll try to help you as best we can. Thanks again. Bye now.